You know how it is. You go to the title company, you sit down at the table, and there's a stack of papers an inch or two thick that the borrower is going to have to sign, including a promissory note, that's 3 to 5 pages, a mortgage, that's 18 pages without riders. Let's talk about all the riders, the condo rider, HOA rider, second home rider, all the riders on top of that. What else? The anti-coercion document, the truth in lending statement, which you're not going to have anymore. Truth in lending, because that's worked into the CD, as we'll discuss. Escrow, account disclosure, all those kinds of things. So that at any given closing, the borrower is going to be signing, what? 50, 60, 70 different papers. We all know that. Now, I guess the government wasn't so concerned about a consumer/borrower that the government wanted to limit the number of forms. All they did was add another form to the mix. Or to look at it another way, now that our CD is a combination of a HUD and a truth in lending statement, maybe they actually got rid of one of the documents. Now they're combined into one. So now instead of 60 documents that a borrower has to sign, they'll have to sign 59. This is going to be one of them. All right, so let's talk about the closing disclosure. What is so different about it? And we're not going to talk a lot about the form itself, because as I look at it, and as you will look at it, you'll see it's basically the HUD. As I said, combined with the truth in lending statement, but some of the figures and some of the information are in different places. It's a little different. Let me tell you what the differences are. Number one, believe it or not, this is true and it's serious. The CFPB conducted a study with our tax money. They conducted a study of, among other things, numbering lines on a closing statement. Line numbers. And they determined that line numbers, like we know on the HUD, you all know the 700 series, right, don't you? All right, we know the 1100 series in the title industry. Every line on the HUD has a number. So you can say, hey, Joe, look at line 701, I need to change it. The CFPB has determined that consumers find line numbers confusing. So if you take a look at our new CD, at least page 1 of it, you're not going to find any line numbers on it. You will find some information that I think is interesting and pertinent. They will be, well, up on top, of course, it shows the usual information, the buyer and the seller, what have you. It's going to show the terms of the loan, which previously were on the truth in lending in part. Now remember, the terms of the loan also are on the promissory note in simple detail to me. They're on the promissory note. All right, it's going to give the interest rate. Well, you see what it's got. Your monthly payment, no line numbers at the bottom, closing costs, cash to close. Of course, that makes sense. That's nothing out of the ordinary. What else though? The government has determined the HUD, once we all get it, and it's been faxed or emailed a number of times. Typically it's letter size, but when you walk into a closing, it's typically on legal size paper. The government says, no more. Legal size? That's confusing. So the CD has to be letter size. All right? What else is in the CD, the closing disclosure? Let's take a look at page 2. Page 2, well, it looks like a HUD. It's got all the figures and they're itemized and everything. However, let me tell you something else that the government has determined. Take a look. We see at the very top it says loan costs. So these will be the costs from the lender and what have you. And it has subheadings. The first subheading you see, letter A, origination charges. Under that, B, services borrowers did not shop for, etc. If you take a look to the right of it in the column, those amounts for each of those subheadings are totaled, but they're totaled upwards. So, right, let's look at subparagraph A, origination charges. Look in the column. You have 405, 300, 1,097. But to get the total of those three, for the subtotal on this page, you have to add them up. Instead of, well, you have to add them up, but in the upward direction. That's what I really mean. All right, now, don't you think that makes it easier for consumers to understand what's going on? You have to add each of the subcategories in this direction. You're not adding it down But I guess that's old-fashioned, because that's what I learned in first grade, so you can't do it that way anymore. You have to add up now. Okay, what else? Take a look at... Take a look at... I'm trying to find it. Some of you probably already know where it is. I'm looking for real estate commission. Where could that be? I just saw it. Where is it? Anybody know? Oh, here it is. Here it is, yeah. Subheading H. And, oh, incidentally, that reminds me. All of the entries in these subcategories, they now have to be in alphabetical order. If you take a look, though, at subparagraph C, services borrower did shop for, these are typically a lot of the title expenses. So if you look at where they have the title expenses listed, the CFPB has said that all of the title charges, while they have to be put in alphabetical order, they all have to start with the word title. All right? And then once you get past the word title, then they're in alphabetical order. All right. Take a look, though, at commission. It's H on the bottom of the page. I'd like to give you a line number. Well, I guess it's what? H, lines 5 and 6. All right. Unlike our current HUD, current as of tonight anyway, unlike our current HUD, the CD gives you one lump sum for the commission. It doesn't, unlike our current HUD, show how the commission was determined. So if you take a look at the top of page 2 of the HUD right now, it's going to say, for example, selling price 100,000 times 6%, and it'll give you the total. Here, they're not going to show you the method by which it was calculated. So what I'm saying to you is, when you get a look at what your commission is, notice I didn't say when you get a copy of the CD. We'll talk about that in a second. When you determine, or when you see your commission set forth on the CD, my suggestion would be, get a calculator out. Make sure they did it right, because you can't see right on it that it was calculated with 6%. You can't see it. All you see is the total amount. All right? Now, let's go to the next step. We looked at the CD. Oh, and incidentally, if you take a look at the last page, it's a lot of the information that was on the truth in lending statement. Same thing, but in a different place. And of course, it doesn't have any line numbering on it. So it gives you these in question and answer format. Assumption, can somebody assume the remaining balance of the loan? Maybe, yes, no, maybe. A demand feature, yes, no, it doesn't, it might. All right, partial payments, your lender may or may not accept partial payments. All right, that is not that unusual. On page 5, in the upper left-hand side, again, it gives you stuff that was on the APR. The total of your payments over the life of your loan. Your finance charge. Take a look at what, I think it's the fourth, I can't give you a line number, but 1, 2, 3, 4. The fourth box, there's your APR. The APR, the annual percentage rate, that was on the truth in lending statement. If you ever looked at that at a closing, it was that document with the 4 little boxes on top, and there was a box in the upper left that had annual percentage rate, APR, and it always showed an interest rate that was more than what was on your promissory note. It was higher. And in anticipation of that, whenever I conduct a closing, I have to pull out the truth in lending statement for the borrower to sign it. So in preparation of that, knowing what's going to happen, I don't wait for the borrower to look at that and start yelling and screaming. I try to head him off at the pass and explain what the APR is first so he doesn't get too worked up about it. It's going to be more because the short story is the government wants now consumers to know what they have agreed to pay to get a loan. Let's look at this. What have they agreed to pay? One of the things they agreed to pay, but only one of the things, is the interest on their loan, which might be 3.5% or 4% or whatever it is. Clearly, they agreed to pay interest. But the government says that's not all they agreed to pay as a condition to getting the loan. What else did they agree to pay? The lender's origination fee, and the credit report, and the flood cert, and all those other things. So the government says, hey, if you take those other costs and you spread them out over the 30-year term of the loan and then convert them into a percentage, and then add that percentage to the percentage you had when you started, which was what the interest rate is as indicated on your promissory note, by definition, you get an interest rate that's higher than what appears on your promissory note. Now, technically, the government is correct. But after, 25 or so years of doing this, I have yet to run into any borrower who says to me, hey Richard, that APR that I see on the Truth in Lending statement, I'm glad that's there because that helped in my understanding of this loan. To me, it's nonsense, because the closing costs, those other things that serve to increase the interest rate as it appears on the APR, on the Truth in Lending, or now on the CD, those other costs are paid at closing. You pay them at closing, and therefore, for every payment from the closing date until the end of the guy's loan is at exactly the interest rate indicated on the promissory note. That's how people think of it. So again, technically, the government is correct, but who thinks of APR, who thinks about it in terms of converting those things into a percentage over the life of the loan? Those are gone at closing. And I have people at closing who are extremely concerned about the APR. And they're going to be concerned about the closing disclosure as well for the same reason. And therefore, I want to tell you, when this comes to the borrower and the borrower starts calling you saying, hey, why is my APR 4% when the interest rate is really 3 3/4? And they're going to ask you, and then you're either going to explain it or you're going to call me and have me explain it to the borrower. Okay, here's what we have to keep in mind. I always tell people that in any closing, there's only, 3 documents that are really important. It's only 3. And the rest of them are disclosures or affidavits or documents by which the bank wants to give you the information about them, or they want to set up automatic payments or what have you for your mortgage payments. All right, what are the important documents in a closing? Up until now, the closing statement, the note, and the mortgage. That's it. And the note, out of that whole stack of papers that the borrower has to sign at the closing, the note is the only document that gives rise to a legal obligation on the part of the borrower. When he signs the note, now he's legally obligated to pay back that loan. The mortgage doesn't personally obligate the buyer to do anything. It just puts up the property as collateral for the loan. All those other documents, disclosures. That's what this closing disclosure is. It doesn't obligate the borrower to do anything. So if somebody takes a look at the annual percentage rate, and as I said, it's going to show more than the interest rate indicated on the promissory note, you need to point out that it's nothing more than a disclosure. It's just the government's kind of awkward, bad way of explaining that particular aspect of the loan. All right, now, why did I say before that you might want to take a look at your commission when you determine what your commission is going to be as indicated on these papers? Why don't you just call the title company as you do now and say, hey Joe, although actually you probably should be calling my title company, Empire Title, but we don't have a Joe there. But you might want to call Kim, one of my attorneys who's sitting right here, who didn't want me to introduce her, so I'm doing it right now. That's Kim DiBiase. So you might want to call Kim, as you have been doing, and say, hey Kim, why don't you please send me a copy of the HUD? And Kim would say, okay, and we scan it and send it out immediately. You'd have it in 30 seconds. As of tonight, at midnight, when you call the title company, not that you're going to call us at midnight, but when you call the title company from this point forth and say, hey, Kim, hey, whoever, please send me a copy of the HUD, 2 things are going to happen. Number 1, the title company is going to say, we don't have a HUD anymore. We have a CD, we have a closing disclosure. And the next thing they're going to say to you is, no, we can't get you a copy of it because the government has determined that on the CD, the closing disclosure, there is personal, private, confidential information from the consumer, like the loan number and that kind of stuff. And therefore, we are prohibited from giving you copies of the closing disclosure. Further, the lender directly won't give you a copy of the closing disclosure either. So how are you going to get a copy of the closing disclosure? If you're on the buyer's end, you're going to have to try to get it from your buyer, who more than likely probably won't care about the confidentiality things and probably won't even understand this when he gets it. Now, let's talk about getting this. Currently, how many times, it's kind of a rhetorical question, we all know the answer, but how many times do you show up at the title company for a closing that is scheduled for Friday at 3 o'clock? And maybe before then, maybe at 2 o'clock or 2:30, you go with your buyer to the bank. In the old days when we used to use cashier's checks, right? You go to the bank with your buyer, but you don't have the final figure yet. So you call the title company, who's going to say, well, we don't have the figures yet from the lender. And further, we don't even have the closing package yet. And the lender, we call the lender, and their processing department says, well, they're working on 5 or 6 other closings first. How come they never work on our closings first? It's always, all right, they're working on someone else's closings first. So you're going to have to wait. You're kind of like, sixth on the runway. All right. So what does that mean? We have to estimate a cash to close for the buyer, who will come in with a cashier's check that's close. If there's a difference, we'll make it up with a cashier's check or whatever. We'll give them change, or maybe they'll owe us a couple of bucks. I'll take a personal check for a few dollars. All right, so we'll make it up. All right, we'll make it up in that sense. Okay, but what happens when you get to the title company and they don't even have the package? They don't have the final HUD. Sometimes you don't get it, as you know, until 2 or 3 hours after your scheduled closing time. Sometimes not until the next day. All right, now, look, I have been up here, and if you're listening to me, and if you read between the lines a little bit, you might get the sense that I'm a little bit cynical and critical about this stuff, and okay, all right, but it's not all bad. Let's think about another aspect of this thing. The CFPB now has said that a consumer/borrower must get a copy of the final closing disclosure at least 3 days before the closing. The final closing disclosure, 3 days before closing. How are they going to get that? Well, here's the deal. The new law gives lenders various options. There's 4 options for delivering the CD to the borrower. They go like this. Number 1, and incidentally, in the materials, there is an outline called the closing disclosure. Is it just another form? And I'll give you the end answer now. Yeah, it's just another form. It's really going to affect workflow. That's what I'm going to start talking about now. It's a workflow issue. A form is just a form. Okay, but in the outline, it talks about the various ways that they can deliver it, which is on page 4 of the outline, up on top, paragraph 4. Here's what they can do. The lender can deliver it with hand delivery. That's one way to do it. I think that's never going to happen, and I think it's unrealistic. It means that the lender or some lender's rep or the local loan officer is going to meet with the borrower/consumer and actually hand deliver a copy. I don't think that's going to happen. What's another option? I'm going to skip the second option. They can email it, that's one of the options, but only if the borrower has agreed in writing to receive the CD by email, and if the lender sends it out by email, there has to be a confirmation email as well from the borrower that he received it. Okay? What's another option? Overnight courier, FedEx, UPS, what have you. They can send it out, and the law says that's fine as long as they get a return receipt, a confirmation receipt that it was delivered. All right, that's not too hard with FedEx or UPS. Now, excuse me? Oh, we're getting there. The question is, what if nobody's home to sign it? All right, let's look at the one I skipped. Option B, good old U.S. snail mail. The CFPB rules state that if a lender puts the CD in the mail, then the borrower is presumed to have received it 3 days later, whether he did or didn't. Not just California. Of course, people always ask me, well, what happens with mail-aways when you have people out of the country? It's a very good question. All right, so what's really going to happen with that? As far as I can tell from seeing what lenders' representatives are talking about. I think they're relying, well, they've already announced they're going to rely on U.S. mail. Specifically, I think, because the law doesn't require any kind of a receipt. And this is regular mail. This isn't certified or registered with the green card that the guy has to sign. And I think it's for the very reason that this gentleman mentioned. What if the borrower's out of town for a couple of days? What if they're not home and, you're not home? What happens when you get certified mail? If you're not home to sign for it, they take it to the post office. That happens to me once in a while. 3 weeks later, I'll go to the post office and pick it up. All right, so the lender is concerned about that. So I think they are choosing to go the U.S. mail route specifically because the borrower doesn't have to confirm receipt. Now, let's think about this another way. Remember, this is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which has passed a provision of this law as part of their regulations that says, we, CFPB lenders, will give you the right to send it out to a borrower, and we don't really care so much whether the borrower actually gets it. Not a heck of a lot of protection there, but I see why they're doing it. Now, how does that affect us? So what? They send out a form 3 days in advance. Okay, so what? Well, let's look at a couple of things. Number one, there is yet another form in your material somewhere, and it's a sheet that's got a bunch of boxes on it. Here it is. Okay? It's a sheet with a whole bunch of boxes. All right. This is kind of a diagram showing when the lender needs to send out the CD in order to comply with the law. So let's look. The top row talks about when your closing is going to be. All right? Let's take the first one. Closing is going to be Monday. The disclosure is due. The CD is due to be delivered to the buyer no later than the preceding Thursday. Right, and incidentally, with this 3-day period, Sundays and federal holidays don't count. And I think there's 12 federal holidays, give or take. All right, Sundays and federal holidays don't count. So many times, this 3-day period is going to be a 4-day period. Now remember, let's keep going down. It's due the preceding Thursday. If they send it out by mail, in order for them to send it out, and remember, they're going to need another 3 days for mailing. So they have to send it out the preceding Monday, basically a week before your scheduled closing date. Now, you may be thinking, okay, so they'll send it out a week before. What's the big deal? Here's the big deal. For them to send it out a week before, for the lender to send out that CD a week before, it means they need all of the information that we typically put into a closing statement, into a HUD. They need to have it, and they have already announced that they require us and you to get it to them at least 10 days, or I should say no later than 10 days before the closing. And what does that mean? Estoppel information from homeowners and condo associations, surveys, inspections, all those kinds of things. On our end, it's the title work, it's other things. We have to get those things to the lender at least 10 days before the scheduled closing date. For them to be able to prepare everything, send it out, wait 3 days for the presumed delivery to the buyer, and then close 3 days after that. Now, I've got just a few minutes left. All right, I'm going to start talking fast. I need everyone to listen fast. Here we go. All right. The law requires a new closing disclosure and a new 3-day period for only 3 things. Don't get worked up about some of the last-minute changes like the dishwasher credit that you don't know about until you do the walkthrough right before the closing. Don't get too worked up about that, but you will in a second. What are the things that the law requires a new disclosure to be delivered for? Number 1, an increase in the APR. That doesn't happen that often. Number 2, a change in the loan product. You'd go to a closing and the buyer would look at everything, or I'll review the note with the borrower and I'll say, hey, this is great, you got an adjustable rate loan, but it's locked in for the first 7 years at one point, whatever, and he'll say, no, I was supposed to have a fixed rate loan. And we have to call the loan officer from the closing table who will say, oh yeah, we mixed something up, blah, blah, blah. All right, they then, under the current law, can redo the documentation, send it to us, and I'll go ahead and close in a few minutes. No more. Change in the loan product requires a new closing disclosure to be delivered and triggers another 3-day period. That closing isn't going to happen on that day. What's the other thing which is never going to happen? The addition of a prepayment penalty. That doesn't happen. Don't worry about that. However, even though those are the only 3 things that require a new delivery and a new 3-day period, here's where I think the problem is going to lie. Right now, as you know, typically the title company prepares the HUD. Okay? And of course, we need to get the figures from the lender, which, as we said, sometimes we don't get until even after the scheduled closing date and time. That's going to change. Here's what's going to happen. The law says that lenders are responsible for problems with regard to the preparation of the CD, for mistakes. Lenders are now going to be held responsible. The law doesn't specify or require that the CD be prepared by anybody in particular. The law doesn't require a lender or a title company to prepare it, but the law does say that no matter who prepares it, the lender's going to be responsible for any mistakes in it. So the lenders have thought about it and decided, I think, I think reasonably, that if they're going to be responsible for it, they better take on the responsibility of preparing it. And that's what they've decided. So most of the big lenders, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and a number of the rest of them that are going to follow suit, rather. Well, you can tell I'm a lawyer, right? All right. Here's what's going to happen. They're going to prepare the closing statement. Now, how many of you have ever negotiated a short sale? Okay, here's the deal. In the old days when short sales first came about, we had to call the loss mitigation department. We had to talk to someone there who would say, hey, fax me. Everything was fax. They didn't do email like the rest of the world. You had to fax them tax returns and the hardship letter and all that kind of stuff. You'd fax 42 pages, and then tomorrow when you called, you could never find that person again. And you found someone else who said, we didn't get a fax, and you'd have to do it again, and this would go on. All right, so the lenders ultimately decided that they need some kind of computer program to deal with short sale negotiations, which led to something called Equator. Anybody know what I'm talking about? All right, here's the deal. As far as we can tell now, we are going to be dealing with lenders in connection with the preparation of the CD with a new program, which I think is based on Equator, and it's going to be called, and is called, Closing Insight. Now, what's going to happen is, we are going to get information to the lender, they're going to get us information. The preparation of the CD is going to be a collaborative effort. That's what's going to happen. But all of the communication between us and the lender will be through Closing Insight, which means when I need to contact somebody on the other side, I have to get on my computer keyboard and start typing. Now, some of the good things about Closing Insight are that it will keep a record of all the communications between the parties. That's a good thing. But let's look at one of the things that the law says we don't need a new delivery of a CD for. We need a new CD. Let's go back to our dishwasher example. You do the final walkthrough, and the dishwasher is leaking. What do we do now? We talk to everybody. We get the seller to give a $75 credit to the buyer. We do it at the closing. Right now, I walk into the other room. I modify the HUD. I reprint it. I bring it back. We close. Not a big deal. Now what's going to happen? The law says if any change is made, we need a new CD. We don't necessarily need a new 3-day period. We need a new CD. However, I'm not the final word on the CD. It's the lender. So now we have to try to get in touch with the lender while we are at the closing table to get them to consent to and make the change in the CD on the fly. Now, yes ma'am?
As far as you know.
Yeah.
Phrasing this, as far as you know.
Correct.
Are the institutions hiring more people in their closing departments to handle all these?
The question is, are the lenders hiring more people? The answer is, of course. Why? Because, look, up until now, they have never had to prepare HUDs. They never prepared closing statements. They don't have the personnel for that. They didn't have the training for that. Okay. Well, while I'm on this track, let me just bash the government one more time because we have only a couple of minutes left. The costs of borrowing have increased dramatically because of the cost of compliance by lenders who now have to and have hired and trained new staff to do something that they have never done. And of course, my concern is even though we're allowed to change the CD at the last minute, it's got to be done on the lender's end, and that means we have to be able to get in touch with someone at the lender's end to actually make the change. All right? Let's do this. Let me tell you a couple of more things, because we have only a couple of minutes. What loans do these new changes apply to? Number one, consumer loans. Residences. It doesn't apply to businesses, doesn't apply to investment property, doesn't apply to reverse mortgages, doesn't apply to all cash transactions. Guess what? You have all cash? The HUD that we've known and loved for decades, right, on an all cash transaction. All right, now, in the materials, I'm going to wrap up. In the materials, you have,
Wait, there's a question.
okay, question, last question.
It doesn't apply to investment property? What about someone buying a second home, a residential home?
That's an investment. That's an investment.
Let me talk to you after. I got to wind up. Let me talk to you afterwards.
It's a
Okay?
second home.
There is a two-page portion of the handout called the top 10 things real estate agents should know about these new rules and regulations. Okay, here's the main thing. The standard 30-day closing that we know and love, if there's a loan, forget about it. In particular, when you have, everybody's using the standard as-is contract with an inspection period and a right to cancel. When that period, let's look at this. The period typically 15 days. Sometimes a little less, but typically it's 15 days. The title company and the borrower, nobody is really going to expend any funds to order condo estoppel and get things done until we know that the buyer is going to proceed with the transaction. So we're going to wait 15 days. Now remember, if a closing is set for 30 days from the effective date of the contract, the first 15 days is gone. The lender needs to have the final information 10 days before closing, which gives all of us only 5 days to get all of the information that we need to get to the lender. It's not going to happen. So what's the general rule of thumb? When you're preparing a contract, 45 days, some people are even recommending 60 as being more realistic. Again, does this benefit the consumer who wants to close? I don't know. All right, with that said, given the fact that I have to wind down now, let me tell you one last thing. I have been doing presentations for quite some time on various topics. I've sat through a number of presentations. I went to school, I went to classes for 100 years. Here's what I learned with all that experience with presentations. To me, the best part of any presentation is when the speaker says, "In conclusion," and that's about where we are right now. So in conclusion, I want to thank you for coming to our breakout session. If you have any questions, feel free to let us know. You've got our contact information on the handouts. Otherwise, we're adjourned.